Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Joy of Learning. Unit 4 is going to teach us all about the different ways that we learn, all of the different things that we are passionate and excited about in life, and some of the things that we're not as excited about. Nevertheless, we are going to dive right into the fun here and talk about some different types of learning today in this first video. Then we'll do a second video this week that really dives deeper into a particular type of conditioning that explains why you would develop a phobia of something or a taste aversion or something of that nature called classical conditioning. So that's what we've got to look forward to this week. Let's dive into the fun. So, what is learning? Learning is defined by psychologists as a lasting change in behavior or mental processes as the result of an experience. And two important ideas that we want to keep in mind when we think about learning. One is that learning involves a lasting change in behavior or knowledge. It doesn't count if it's short lived. And number two, mental processes are difficult to observe and study compared to behaviors. So, humor me if you will, and think about a couple of things that you've learned in the past week. And these don't have to be related to school. For me, I took a sushi making class with my son. So, I learned how to make sushi. I also learned how to do the gritty for his benefit. Super embarrassing. You can make fun of me next time. And I'm also learning about Japan because my seventh grader really wants to go there, and we're going to plan a family trip there for next Easter break. So, those are some things that I am learning. And if you wanted to make sure that I actually learned the things that I just told you about, it would be much easier for you to see whether I've actually learned how to make sushi or do the gritty than to see whether I've learned anything meaningful about Japan, because sushi making and doing the gritty are actually observable behaviors that you could see me do or not do so well, as opposed to the cognitive learning that I do when I'm learning about Japan in particular. So just to kind of illustrate that idea for you when we look at those important ideas. Okay, learning is so much more than school books and tests. Without learning, our lives would just be a series of reflexes and instincts, and we would be just like the lower animals. We wouldn't be able to communicate or have memories of our past or goals for the future. And so, learning is this really cool thing that does influence our unique humanness when we look at the higher forms of learning, even though we do share a lot of lower forms of learning in common with animals. And so, specifically, next time in class, when we look at operant conditioning, you'll see that you can train a person or a pet to do really similar behaviors based on the consequences that they're getting for those behaviors. What we're going to do in this introductory video is look at some different types of learning, because we learn things obviously in very different ways depending on whether we're learning something like a social rule, like how to act at a dance, skills and concepts like how to use an iPad or install its software, life lessons like how to have a great relationship with a boyfriend or girlfriend, and we learn different types of things in different ways is kind of the big idea here. So we're going to start out by looking at some behavioral forms of learning. Then we'll look at some higher order forms of learning in this particular video. All right, so behavioral learning refers to any type of learning that can be described in terms of responses that we make to stimuli in our environments. We have classical conditioning, which is based on involuntary or reflexive behavior, aka any behavior controlled by your autonomic nervous system. So if you've ever eaten a big old Chipotle burrito and then gotten food poisoning from that, you had an autonomic barf response. And maybe in the future, you've learned then to associate Chipotle with that barf response. Hence, you never want to eat Chipotle again for the rest of your life. That would be an example of classical conditioning. Operant conditioning has to do with voluntary behaviors that we can choose to do or not. So maybe you go up to somebody and give them a compliment and they smile at you really widely and give you a compliment back. They just reinforce your behavior. You feel great about that and you're more likely to give that person a consequence. Again, I'm sorry, a compliment again, because they gave you a positive consequence. We're going to look at a couple of key people as well as their theories of learning in this basic introductory overview to learning in particular. And so you probably remember back in Unit 1, we talked about different approaches to psychology, like the cognitive approach, the humanistic approach, and we talked about behaviorism or the behavioral approach. Now, John Watson is considered to be the father of behaviorism, and he's famous for emphasizing objective and observable data, like people's behavior and reactions, as opposed to focusing on any sort of thoughts or internal processes, which we really can't access very well. Watson felt like we can see all that we need to know about learning by observing outward behavior of people and animals. He's actually most famous for this really controversial, unethical experiment called the Little Albert experiment, where, you guessed it, a sweet little 9-month-old baby named Albert was offered up by his mother to go through this experiment where basically John Watson conditioned a phobia in little baby Albert of white rats, which then generalized to all other furry white objects. Super unethical, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we dive into classical conditioning in particular. Another famous guy is Ivan Pavlov, and he's best known for his work describing classical conditioning. And Ivan Pavlov was actually studying digestion in dogs when he observed that he had accidentally classically conditioned them. So then he got all excited in classical conditioning. He left the digestive area and eventually conducted a famous experiment where he conditioned dogs to salivate in response to the sound of a bell, which is something that normally would never cause a dog to salivate, because he purposely built an association between the bell and the food. And that laid the foundation for behaviorism, which came a little bit later. And this particular example might not sound that thrilling to you, but the principles underlying classical conditioning do explain why we would get a phobia or a taste aversion or other things like that. So we'll kind of learn the basics of that in our next video. We also have some people associated with another form of behavioral learning, operant conditioning, and one of them is Edward Thorndike, and he's best known for his work on learning theory in general, and specifically for articulating what he called the law of effect, which basically says that behaviors followed by positive consequences are likely to be repeated again, whereas behaviors followed by punishing consequences are not likely to be repeated again. And you read about his puzzle boxes with his kitty cats in your reading for this week. Another big player in the area of operant conditioning is B.F. Skinner, and he's best known for specifically developing the theory of operant conditioning based on Thorndike's law of effect. And so operant conditioning in general says that we can manipulate the rate and frequency at which a certain voluntary behavior occurs by manipulating the consequences that follow it. Skinner is famous for training animals in his Skinner box, and he showed that he could change the rate of behavior by manipulating the consequences that he provided for that behavior. So specifically, he would put rats into a box, and he taught them to press a lever for food. And when the lever pressing behavior was met with food, of course, the rats would press the lever early and often whenever they got placed into the box. He then associated the lever press with a really unpleasant, mild electric shock. And he demonstrated that just as quickly as the rats had learned to press the lever, they stopped pressing the lever when that same behavior was met with a punishing consequence. So the idea there is that we can manipulate the exact same behavior based on the different types of consequences we give it. We also have Tolman, who's responsible for the theory of latent learning. Latent means hidden. And so Tolman basically stated that learning can occur even if there's no reward presented for the learning. However, the learner is unlikely to demonstrate their knowledge unless they actually do get rewarded. So he demonstrated this in an experiment where rats were trained to run through a maze without a reward. And they learned how to do it, but then they stopped doing the behavior because why would they? But then eventually he introduced a big giant chunk of cheese, which is a positive consequence, obviously, for a rat. They could smell it at the start, and they started running the maze faster than they ever had before to get to the reward. So he concluded then that the rats had learned a mental map of the maze, even when they weren't directly rewarded for it, but they demonstrated that learning way more quickly and easily when they did actually receive a reward. Then we have Albert Bandura, who's known for his social learning theory. So far, we've talked about learning either directly through our own experiences and associations with stimuli. Well, that's how we've talked about learning so far. But social learning theory says that we also can learn things not by experiencing that thing directly, but simply by watching other people and modeling their behaviors. And so that sounds quite obvious to us, but Bandura was really famous for shaking up the field of learning because before him, everything was about behaviorism and how we can only learn by direct experience. And he's like, no, we can learn plenty of things just by observing other people do those things. And he has a famous aggression experiment with a Bobo the clown doll that I'll tell you about in a couple minutes. It's wild. Again, back in the day when there were no sort of ethical boundaries around the types of experiments that we could do with pets and children. Okay. So how does learning happen other than language and words? Well, we definitely learn from experience, and we definitely learn by association. Let's unpack learning from experience. We learn when our actions have consequences, and we also learn by watching what other people do. So you guys have had the experience of watching some of your friends cheat in school. Let's say some of them have received consequences so severe that that influences you not to cheat in school. Others have probably gotten away with cheating, and maybe that influences you to perhaps want to cheat when you're feeling particularly overwhelmed or you don't understand something. We also learn by association, right? So especially when actions that we do become associated with pleasant or not so pleasant consequences. For instance, when my son makes an amazing effort and cleans his room, I am super complimentary of him and I give him some extra money maybe to buy a Lego at Target because he's demonstrating being respectful. Or when he doesn't clean his room, then I'm probably less inclined to want to do something kind for him in return. Couple of other major types of learning. And here in your notebook, I've given you kind of the basic information, and it would be great for you to put in your own either personal examples here, or you can use my examples from the presentation as well. But insight learning is a type of learning that basically just leads to a sudden realization or a light bulb moment, an aha moment regarding a problem. In insight learning, a lot of times the learner has tried in lots of different ways to understand the problem, but they just don't. And then all of a sudden, some sort of light bulb switches in their brain and they're like, oh, I get it. But it's really hard to track what, in fact, helped them get it. This used to happen to me in math all the time. I don't know if this has happened to you, but it's basically where you're just kind of struggling, and then, oh, that rewarding moment where it just clicks for you, and now you've learned it. An example from real life would be Sudoku. I don't know if any of you like that game, but suddenly seeing a pattern or number placement that you hadn't noticed before would be a great example of insight learning. We also have latent learning, which I just spoke with you about. And again, the idea here is that learning can occur, but it's not always likely to be seen. It might remain hidden or latent unless the appropriate reward is there. So you guys, I don't know about this application. It does not seem overly relevant to me. I'm fascinated that your book chose it, but it says, a high school teenager isn't much interested in history. Then, when trying to impress a girl, he's surprised at how much he knows about the Industrial Revolution and American Civil War. My question is, Does that knowledge actually impress a girl? I am very curious about that. I wonder if something else might impress a girl more, but maybe there's just an amazing history lover out there, and that is the reward he needed to demonstrate his knowledge about the Industrial Revolution. And then lastly, we have social learning or observational learning, like Bandura talked about. And so this is where learning occurs through observing, imitating, and modeling. It's also influenced by our own factors, like how interested we are, how motivated we are to learn the thing, whether we're paying attention or not, and any sort of emotions associated with the learning experience. So you guys can probably think of teachers that you just absolutely love to learn from. You're in a positive attitude when you're in their classroom. You have positive feelings going on in their classroom. And so therefore you might be more motivated to engage and pay attention. And if you're particularly interested in the material, motivated to learn it, then you're going to learn a lot from observing. If those things are the opposite, maybe not as much, right? So Bandura is famous for doing this Bobo doll experiment, and you can see clips from the original footage from back in the 60s here, but Bandura basically demonstrated that children learn and imitate behaviors that they haven't been taught directly. They've simply observed other people doing those behaviors, and this was like a breakthrough in the field of psychology. So basically what happened is these kids watched a video of this grown-up just beating up a Bobo the Clown doll. You can see it in the top line across there. This lady's just going to town on this Bobo doll. And then when the children were later allowed to play in a room with the Bobo doll, they also began to imitate the aggressive behavior and actions that they had seen, even though nobody told them to do so and nobody taught them directly to do so. They also just beat up the poor Bobo doll. And so that would be an example of observational learning. If you hear grown-ups in your life talk about how you're not allowed to play particular video games, or you weren't allowed to have social media until you were a particular age, a lot of psychologists that talk about those things cite Bandura's original research in terms of the power of observational learning and why you don't just want to let your kids be exposed to anything out there, because they do learn so much. And you guys know this from your own lives, things that you see on social media. You learn so much positive and negative by observing other people. Last type of learning we're going to look at is learned helplessness. And so I put the definition and the animal studies down for you here. We're going to revisit this in more detail when we look at operant conditioning. Unfortunately, the idea behind learned helplessness is when somebody is stuck or an animal is stuck in a situation where no matter what behavior they do, they can't change the negative consequences that are happening to them. They develop this tendency called learned helplessness, where they stop trying to do anything because they've learned that their behavior doesn't influence the consequences in their life. And it's a very sad finding. And so you can take a look at the applications here. You can pause the video and read through some of those and put some of those into your notebook, and we'll revisit that when we look at operant conditioning. Last thing we're going to look at here is the idea of biological preparedness and constraints. The idea here is that as human beings, we are biologically wired to learn associations between some things more quickly than others. And we're also biologically constrained, meaning that we can't possibly learn how to do some things given our biological makeup. You can kind of disregard the information here about Garcia's rats, but I did want to present this vocab to you here in this particular space. Okay, and so an example would be biological preparedness suggests that humans are more likely to develop phobias, irrational fears of objects and situations that would have actually posed a threat to us in the past. Things like heights or darkness or snakes or spiders that could have actually killed our ancestors. We are not biologically predisposed to develop an overwhelming fear of cupcakes or rainbows or footy pajamas or something like that. So to some extent, the idea behind biological preparedness is that we're hardwired to learn some things more quickly than others, okay? Also, an example of a biological constraint would be humans no matter how hard we try, are not capable of breathing underwater. We physiologically can't do that skill no matter how hard we try. So that would be a biological constraint, just like it would be a biological constraint for a chimpanzee to try to use spoken language. Its mouth physically can't create that, and so it's not going to do it. And that leads us to the end of our overview of learning in general. Stay tuned in our next video for a deep dive into classical conditioning, where we will explore your phobias and taste aversions and other types of things of that nature.